Welcome to the Research Works podcast, brought to you in association with the Healthy Strides Foundation. Your hosts are Dr. Dayna
and Dr. Ashleigh Thornton, and we're here to interview world-leading researchers, clinicians, and people with lived experience
to support your practice in being more evidence-based.
Welcome back to another episode of the Research Works podcast. Hello, Dayna.
Hello, Ash.
How are you going?
I'm good. I feel like we meet the brief, clinician, researcher.
Yeah.
I think we should be okay to be on this podcast.
Yes. We're going to introduce a guest. But the guest today is
us.
Dayna Poole and Ashleigh Thornton.
Welcome, everyone. Well, we did think that there's actually some good stuff that we can talk about and break down. We've been talking to so many people lately and my thoughts are going wild thinking about all the different topics and how we actually use it. And we thought, well, let's just take a moment to debrief about it.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And I think there's a lot of things that we've talked through across all of the seasons of Research Work so far that this conversation is relevant to. Because what we really wanted to talk about today is the idea of knowledge translation and then moving down that pipeline, I suppose, implementation science and what it actually means and what it actually takes to be able to take evidence and implement it into clinical practice.
Yes.
It's something that we talk about all the time, but I think it's really useful to have not a step-by-step guide, but I suppose some examples of what that actually looks like in real life.
Yeah, I think that's so great. I love how you frame things, Ash. You're very good. You are such a great thematic analyzer in real time. It's fantastic. I love it. But it's so true. We can have, and I was listening to a podcast, I was talking about it, and it was all about communication styles and how we communicate. And he said, look, we actually have a lot of knowledge, but we need to choose to use it. And how we use it is actually the hardest part because so much is involved. And then when you think about it, that's why we have all these frameworks that have become very popular. We've noticed them being used in a lot of the papers lately, and it's the CFA, the Consolidated Framework of Implementation Research.
Yep.
And it lists a whole bunch of constructs, and the whole idea of that is to go, well, how do you take research and put it into practice? Because that's the big question.
It is the million-dollar question.
It is indeed. But before we get into that, now, Ash, a few weeks ago, unfortunately you couldn't make it into the studio, and I had the duties to come up with icebreaker question.
Yep.
Which is a big deal for me because I actually find them very difficult to come up with. And so you didn't partake in this, but I think it would be really great to have you in this. So I'm going to put you in the hot seat. I haven't told you any of these yet.
No, you haven't.
And like I said to our guest when I tried this on them, this is life-changing. Not.
Okay. No pressure.
No pressure, not at all. Okay, so these are fast-fire questions. Okay. The first one is crisps or chocolate?
Oh, gosh. Chocolate for me.
Chocolate, yeah. And it is a tough one, isn't it? Because sometimes it depends on the texture and the feelings and the emotions. But I I think mine changes from day to day. But I like that it's chocolate. Yeah,
and it's not to say that I don't dislike a crisp. I do love a good crisp, but I just find myself drawn to the chocolate.
And is it milk chocolate or dark chocolate?
Milk chocolate.
Milk chocolate?
Yeah, not really a dark chocolate person.
What do you think of 70%? Is that already too high?
I can tolerate it.
You can tolerate it.
Yeah. My favourite chocolate, and I only get it once a year, is the little Easter eggs that have the strawberry filling in them.
Ooh, yeah, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
It's quite a shot, isn't it, of sugar?
Yeah.
Well, interestingly, producer Ed, when people buy him presents, they buy him chocolate that is at least 90%. It's just a bit too much for me.
It's not really chocolate, is it?
The only way to eat chocolate.
Oh, don't dive
No.
in on that one. Okay, as we continue. Dogs or cats?
Dogs.
That was quick. Nice one. I agree. Dogs for me.
Yeah.
Text or call?
Text.
Oh,
no, it's person dependent.
Yeah.
There's some people that
What's the threshold? You call me.
I don't know. It's just.
I like to say. You text me as well, but you call me.
I call you, Yep. It's dependent. There's certain people that I will always go to for a phone call. You're one of them. And then there's some people that I really enjoy text conversation with.
Yeah.
Or voice notes.
Voice notes as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I would say predominantly text. Yeah, with a few exceptions.
With a few exceptions.
Yeah.
Oh, I like that. I like that. I do like when I see my top 5 of people who I call a lot. I'm like, whoa, my husband is 3rd. Okay. Would you rather watch a film or play video games?
Oh, watch a film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Genre?
I'm pretty basic, so rom-coms.
Love a good rom-com.
But I also really enjoy a thriller.
Yeah.
But like a psychological or a political thriller.
Nothing too bloody or gory.
No, I'm not about the violence.
Not about the violence, right. Okay.
So it's quite a niche. Quite a niche
area.
Lane, yeah.
But at least you know what you're into. That's good.
Yeah.
Chinese food or Indian food takeaway?
Indian.
Oh, that was quick as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love Indian food.
After we did this last time, I've had Indian food takeaway for like twice.
What did you answer out of curiosity?
Well, I feel like Chinese should be my go-to but then I cook Chinese food as well. But then sometimes I don't cook Chinese food the way the takeaway people would do it, where it's deep fried first and then it's fried.
Yeah.
And that's why mine tastes way too healthy and good. So I do like to go for that, but I don't cook Indian food very much. So I'd rather go Indian food takeaway.
Yes, and a really good.
'Cause I don't cook it.
A really good Indian. Delicious.
Yeah, when the spices have been adequately brought to life.
Yes. So this is my thing. It's I don't like things that are spicy just for the sake of being spicy.
100%. Yeah.
It's got to have flavour.
Yeah.
And a really good curry with a really nice flavour. Can't beat it. And some garlic naan.
Garlic naan, yes, yeah. Thank goodness for that. I find that as I've gotten older, my tongue can still handle hot spice, but my belly can't anymore.
Yeah.
It's changed. So I need to tone it right down these days.
We must adapt.
Change. Must adapt. All right, new shoes or new haircut?
Ooh.
Big one for you.
New haircut.
New haircut.
I think. Well, how extreme does the new haircut have to be? Because I've worn my shoes in, I get really attached to them. I don't like wearing new shoes.
Don't you?
No.
Oh, okay.
Once I have my shoes how I like them, I get very attached to them.
Feet. Yeah, okay. It's a new haircut. Big night out or quiet night in?
Quiet night in.
Agreed. Someone wanted to have dinner with me and they had to push it back to start it at 7 p.m. And she's like, is that too late? I'm like, yes. Because it's 8:30, I'm already in bed in PJs.
I had dinner with a friend last night and then it got to just before 9 o'clock and we looked at each other and thought, it's time.
To go.
It's time.
Instagram or TikTok?
Ooh. I'm quite partial to TikTok these days.
Are you really, Ash?
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't upload anything to TikTok.
Yeah.
I like to
consume the
content.
To consume
TikTok.
Yep.
If I need to just switch off.
Yes. But you participate in
But my algorithm on TikTok is very very light.
Nothing too deep. Yes. No, that's good. I like it.
Renovation tutorials and hair tutorials and things like
that. Pool or beach?
Beach.
Beach, yeah. I can see that. That's good. Mm-hmm. Lose your wallet or lose your phone?
Oh. Lose my wallet because everything I need is on my phone now, which is really bad. I have my wallet on my phone basically.
Yeah, it's like that these days.
Yeah.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. You've really come into the modern age.
I have.
Modern era. Yeah. Well, that was all my questions. Profound, right?
I passed.
Yeah, you passed.
Yay.
We can still be friends.
Except for the TikTok thing.
Except for the TikTok. Yeah, the TikTok thing made me tilt my head a little bit, but that's okay.
Instagram is a nice way to connect.
It is.
Instagram is how I keep up with what's happening in my circles of people that I know, but TikTok is nice for just frivolous
true.
Scrolling.
And it's my Instagram, I keep it very curated to my friends. Like it's private and I only have my friends and I cull it every 6 months to a year. If I haven't seen that person for a while, I haven't connected.
I'm pleased to have made the cut.
You're still in there. Yeah. You're still in there. Well, I hope everyone else played along. But it was good to do that one with you.
Thank you.
Let's get into...
Thank you for taking the icebreaker.
Oh, you're really welcome. It does give me help for heart palpitations sometimes. Like, is this going to be good? Does it make the grade? Yeah. Well, we really want to talk about how we implementate. How we...
That's very scientific.
That was great.
For everyone following along.
Sorry. How we implement research, because we can talk to a lot of people, which we have. It's over 200 episodes with a lot of papers there attached to those papers as well. but how do you actually put it into place?
Well, let's go back a step and start with knowledge translation, because that's quite a big concept that we've spoken about a few times on the podcast now, and we often talk about, we often end episodes of the podcast with questions to our guests about, what do you want clinicians to take away from this paper or this work that you're doing? We ask about how people might start to think about implementing things into practice. But actually what we don't cover in those episodes is that there's a whole science behind it.
That's right.
And it's quite a detailed process if it's something that you're doing thoroughly. But, we don't want to scare people off that. What we wanted to do today is kind of talk through what that looks like. And I know, through the Healthy Strides Foundation, you've got some really amazing examples of what that looks like in practice. But when we're talking about knowledge translation, we're really talking about this process of synthesizing information, getting it to the right people in the right way, and then those people applying it in a way that is meaningful to them in their context.
That's right. Yep, absolutely. Because it has to be contextual and it has to utilize your skills as a clinician. And sometimes it does mean upskilling as well. But a lot of the times as new research comes about, it's the gentle tweaking and understanding and embracing that. So, a good example for us, and we can go into more detail if we want to, but, when we really understood the concept that mobility is a human right, and that was a paper that we have talked to the authors about. That was 2022, mobility is a human right. Well, that framed a lot of our thinking to go, okay, right, we need to take this very seriously and we need to start this process much earlier. So we might have just started the process for 3 or 4-year-olds, but actually that was still a little bit late. So we now started a whole lot earlier. So we think about that concept is what we talk about with families right when they first come to us, when they might just be 8, 9, 10 months old, but we're already thinking that based on that paper. So that's an example of, what you're currently doing, and then research comes out and these great concepts come out and you go, okay, great idea. This is how we can tweak. And that's a very internal thing that as an organisation and as individuals who are therapists all really buy into, and that becomes part of your language. And there already is implementation because you're able to work at that level.
And I think one of the really important things that if we look at the definition of knowledge translation, there's this really important component in there is that it's iterative. So it is something that is constantly evolving. And you should be continuously, gathering information and feedback and data that allows you to make those tweaks and pivots that you might need to make it work at an individual level, but also at an organizational level. And that might change over time, and that's okay.
That's right. There's nothing about it that's rigid, is there? There's nothing about it that's just binary. It's one or the other. There is so much nuance in that because it involves so many people. And I love that when you look at we all love a good framework.
We do.
And the CIFA, like we said before, it has so many different domains that you can think about that look at the barriers and facilitators to how we'd implement it. And so you can go at each level and kind of go, all right, this I can influence. This I can't influence, but how can I influence it?
Maybe not influence it directly.
That's right.
But there might be things that you can do that have an indirect influence on those things. And we'll get through, we'll go through what they are. But let's start with, I suppose, if we're looking at this implementation framework, the CIFA, and maybe we can put a link to the paper that covers what the most recent version of that looks like. The first thing that we're looking at is the innovation domain, or the thing that we're trying to implement. So whether that is a new intervention, an educational program, something like that. It's the thing that you've got, maybe you've heard about it on the podcast or you've come across it in a paper and you think this would be something that would improve our practice and we should implement it. Right?
I love it.
So what are the things that we need to know about that program or product or thing that we're trying to implement? We need to know how it can be adapted. I think that's a really important thing, particularly in the context that we're talking about. You know, what can we modify, what can we adapt, bearing in mind that oftentimes there are components of fidelity that we need to adhere to. You know, you can't go completely off-piste and change something entirely.
Right.
There are often key ingredients that need to remain as they are, right? Can you just kind of talk to how that actually works in practice?
I can talk about it from the perspective of, okay, so we're going to go back to our first episode, which we often think about and go, oh, cringe, oh my goodness. But thank you for everyone who still listens to our first episode. So in that first episode, we talked about my study, which was the iStride study. And that it's all about locomotor training in children with cerebral palsy, classified within GMS levels 3, 4 and 5. And it was that study, in actual fact, that was the reason why we started the Healthy Strides Foundation, was to bring that research into like actual practice and make it available to the wider community. So there's a lot of implementation there, and I didn't know about the CIFA back then, I would say. But when I go through it, I can see why each of those domains is so important. And the innovation piece for this was that it had started with locomotor training as a concept that was developed for spinal cord injuries, and that was well published, you know, the early 2000s. And so by the time it got to 2012, 2013, really wanted to see how that could be translated to children with cerebral palsy. So you had to know what the concepts were of locomotor training first. And it was very clear there were these 4 steps. You know, you want to optimize kinematics, you want to optimize lower limb weight bearing, you want to reduce compensatory strategies, and you want to look for adaptability. And so we took all of that and we started testing it in children and co-designed it with them. Kind of go, well, how does this dosage work in this population? How do they tolerate this time for it? Are there other things we need to add to it? Of course, it had to be much more fun than just standing on a treadmill. So we had to still keep all the main principles, and then we started to adapt it to the population with families, with children, with the clinicians doing the work, so we could actually feel physically what it could look like. And then from there, we developed a protocol. And then in that protocol, we then tested it. And that's how we had this sort of series of pilot studies in a way for about 2 years. And then we put it into practice into an RCT because we wanted to see whether robotics was more effective or not. And it wasn't. It didn't help any more than doing it manually. So that study took about 2.5 years to carry out. And then from there, we had quite a clear idea of how we could implement this, because we'd already thought about how we could work together to make this protocol work. So that's a great example of that adaptability in that setting of the actual just, you know, the protocol itself of locomotor training.
Yeah, that's very comprehensive. Thank you. And I think the other thing to be mindful of with implementation, you know, not every innovation or not every product or program that comes out is going to be possible.
That's right.
For you to implement in your context. Say, you know, hypothetically, if the evidence had suggested that robotics was of, you know, there was greater benefit to using the robotics than what was previously used. That's not possible for everyone to go out and purchase the relevant equipment and then get the training that they need to be able to use that.
That's right.
So, you know, you might come back to the evidence base and look at what else there is out there that does show strong evidence.
That's true.
That is practical for you to implement.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's really important. And underpinning all of that is you have to make sure that as you're developing something, that it is completely in line with where the evidence base is at. So all these frameworks we talk about are so vital. So, you know, the ICF 2001, when that came out, you know, you were very clear about body structure and function, activity and participation. And as everything started to shift to go, hey, task specificity is really important. You know, that was in the early noughties during that time when, you know, Klein and Jones really looked at that sort of 10 principles of neuroplasticity. So then you're really implementing that. Then the F words comes out and you're like, oh, if you're going to do something, you've got to think about friends, family, function, future, fitness. You know, you've got to think about all those things. And then the green light interventions, you know, the traffic light system comes out, and it's very clear that these top-down approaches were far more effective than bottom-up. So you know that you have to, if you're going to look at something, you keep in line with all of that as you're developing it, because that is where the evidence base is at.
Yeah.
And that's that innovation happens within current knowledge as well. So you're on the edge of it, but you're not doing something that's completely contrasting with those theories of motor learning and what we already know.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And then we also have to remember when we're looking at the framework that research and then implementation of research doesn't happen in a vacuum.
No,
so there's a lot of context that we have to consider when we're looking at implementing evidence in practice. And, you know, the first thing that we think about obviously is the setting in which we're trying to implement it. And in that framework, they often refer to that as the inner setting. So things that we might want to consider, you know, at a very basic level, what kind of infrastructure do you have? What do you have already that you can use to your advantage and that would work with what it is that you're trying to implement? You know, what kind of training do the people have who are trying to implement this new evidence? And, you know, I think you could probably speak quite comprehensively about training and how important training is from a workforce perspective and, you know, getting buy-in for the implementation of a new program.
Because there's so much that you need to think about, right? There's no point creating an intervention and wanting to implement it if there's going to be a huge physical toll on the therapist.
Or you need 3 months of training every day to be able to deliver it. Like it's just not feasible. And if
the cost of doing the training is X amount for how many weeks. I think those things are really, really important. It really needs to build on the base skills of the therapist training in itself, as in like undergrad training. And then there has to be ways that you can actually specify whether it's done properly. And I love how, you know, Brian Hoare and Susan Greaves talked about it beautifully. It's like you can call it bimanual therapy, but is it bimanual therapy? Like what theory is it being underpinned by? And so therefore your training has to be specific to make sure that it is as hands-off as possible. Doesn't mean you never use your hands. You just use it very thoughtfully. And how do you teach people that clinical reasoning of what's too much and what's too little? That nuanced part is quite important, but you can protocolize it, and those, I don't think that's a word, but you know,
it is now.
It is, You have to have a protocol because when you think about the standard you'd have for medicine would have protocols for, you know, surgical procedures,
drug administration,
drugs, absolutely. And so the standard is set there, and that's how they know that what they apply, you're more likely to get the same response, you know, as many times as possible. So we have to do the same thing, and we're actually in full control of that. That's something that we can influence on our level as clinicians, working within an organisation, as a team. You can do this together to create that, and that's often a barrier if if people don't want to do that. But that again tells you where you might want to work and where you might not want to work. So
and they talk about this tension for change quite a lot. You know, is there an appetite for change? If there's not, then there's probably some other strategies that you might need to use to get people to a point where they are on board with the change.
That's right.
You know, this is, and again, it's an iterative process. So we're, you know, testing where that inner setting is at currently. Is it appropriate to implement this evidence-based change now, or do we need to do some work in the lead up to that? And that might be awareness raising, education, training, reflection, those kinds of things to get the organisation the staff to a point where they are going to take that on board.
And that's where all the knowledge translation tools come into handy. You know, like, you know, what other training packages look like? Are they in the video format? Is it podcast format? Is it actual training in person, and what materials do they get from it? So that is actually so important from a process of bringing research to life is that part, the contextualizing part.
And that will be very different for every organisation. It'll be probably very different for every type of change you're trying to implement. You know, some things might be a really small tweak to what is currently happening. Some things are perhaps a really big fundamental philosophical change in the way that practice happens.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I guess that comes down to scope of practice, right? Like being really clear what your scope of practice is and what population you might work with, because, you know, it's absolutely impossible to be jack of all trades. You can't do it all. But what is your scope of practice and what can you do really well, and be very clear about that is where the current evidence is sitting. And you know that because your finger's on the pulse. And those are the things that you can change and adapt according to the evidence that comes out.
And then if we kind of zoom out a little bit and think about the outer setting of the organisation or the team or wherever it is that we're trying to implement this change, there are some factors that will influence how successful that implementation is.
Yes.
We might not necessarily have direct control over those, but they are important things to consider. Things like local attitudes, external pressures. You know, we're not, as we said before, we're not operating in a vacuum. We might not have direct influence over, but can you think of any examples of things that might have impacted a change that you were trying to implement that you didn't have any direct control over?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So like funding's always like the biggest, easiest thing to think about. And it doesn't matter where you are in the world, whether you're in Australia and you have the National Disability Insurance Scheme, whether you're in the UK and you've got the NHS, or in the US with different kinds of insurance policies that there might be. Either way, there needs to be some funding to be able to access services. That's just the basic way that the world works. And what they will fund and what they won't fund, and really knowing what that landscape is important, because if you're trying to provide an intervention that is going to be effective, there has to be a dosage requirement for it to be effective. And so you may need to really look at the literature, or you look at how you implement that research and really look at how long it takes to make that change. So that dosage, how you apply it, there's no point coming up with a dosage that is just inaccessible by funding. There's something that needs hundreds upon hundreds of hours. Clearly, that's not something that's going to be funded. So let's look at things that are really practical. And we thought about that right from the outset of going, okay, there's going to be finite funding. How do we make the most out of that small amount of funding that they do have? Therefore, how do we get all of these principles that we know that work to work, and what are our outcome measures associated with that, so we can truly measure it? And that sets up the expectations. So we can't change the amount of funding. You can certainly advocate for more, but it's going to fluctuate and change. But how can you make the most of what you've got? And therefore, what does your dosage look like? What are the expectations that you might look like? And your recommendations, you know, if they can only afford, say, therapy once a month, for example, okay, then what does that look like? And therefore, what are the structures I need to put in place for that person outside of that?
Return on investment.
That's right. Yeah. So those things we can have control over, even though the external pressures can seem really big and out of our control, which they are. Like it's, you know, as a clinician working, how do you influence policy at that level? Together we probably can. Over many years we probably could. But in the time being the person in front of you, how do you do that? And those are the things that you can definitely do. And still stay really true to your principles. You can still do that.
And then throw a critical incident like COVID into the mix, something you have no control over whatsoever. And you have to pivot again, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think that's how I felt that COVID for us as an organisation, so, you know, we're not for profit and we're only a few years into operating by that stage, is yes, we all went to telehealth, and we don't continue to do that now, but we could see what telehealth was really good for and where it really worked to save costs, and therefore we can provide that as something that has no additional cost, for example, now, because it didn't cost us anymore. But we know what we can use it for, and it just makes you really think about resources. What's the minimum amount of resources you can use to achieve that outcome?
And then one of the things that I think is really important for the sustainability of change is having people champion it and lead it. And can you talk a bit about how you get buy-in, how you create champions for change?
I would say that comes from the lived experience. We have to be always thoughtful. Like, you know, that's such a big term that we use in research these days, and you can see it being used all the time. But you also need it for implementation. And if you involve consumers, in a really meaningful way throughout the whole process, and you take on their feedback. So you ask for feedback. That's an informal way that you could do it without a committee. Yeah. So you could actually actively ask for feedback. Anonymous, they can provide it for you from time to time. You can take that information and continue to mold it, because at the end of the day, the consumers, they're going to feel what it's like in the real world every day and what they can and can't take. Mm-hmm. So the consumer involvement part continues through, and that is what helps you keep the finger on the pulse. Otherwise, you can just keep going and go, everything's going well, everything's going fine, and your metrics can still look quite good in terms of your outcome measures, but keeping your finger on the pulse on what's really important at that time in the culture, in the landscape that people are up, cost of living, all that kind of stuff. You can do that by making sure you're always involving consumers.
Yep.
And I think it just continues through, doesn't it, from research all the way. So that's what we do. We have a consumer that is actually on staff, which has been really important. So if things change, we know. And we always ask for feedback. We always provide, information on the outcomes. And then ask for feedback even if we're not sure that it's going to be a positive one. It's just so we can learn, what process can be better for you.
Yeah.
And that's how you can make sure it can be implemented and it stays implemented.
Yeah.
Because it does take, that's why they talk about the 17 years of knowledge to practice, because it takes some time for it to get into place and then to stabilize and find its place in life before it's like fully ingrained into being normal.
Yeah. We think about, habits that we have as humans and how hard it is to establish a new habit, how hard it is to break an old habit.
Yes.
If we feel like they're not serving us anymore, change is really tricky.
Yeah.
And particularly in environments where there are complex challenges, health challenges, societal challenges, family challenges, that makes things even more complex. So it's not easy.
No, that's right. It's not.
It can be very time consuming.
Yeah.
But, frameworks like this one, I think help people to focus on the things that are important for change, help give, I suppose, a bit of a guidebook for how you might document change, because I think that's really important to be able to reflect on it and to be able to, make sure things are being adapted to your context without straying too far away from the ingredients that we know make them evidence-based, because that's a bit of a tension, isn't it? If you're constantly adapting and evolving a program or an intervention, you want to make sure that you are staying true to the things that make it robust.
That's right.
Scientifically.
That's right. Yeah. What are the non-negotiables? What are the absolute non-negotiables? And if things have to change, then you go, okay, before you release into the commercial world, you actually need to make sure you test it properly, because that actually is your responsibility, right? If you're going to sell a product, if you're selling a drug, you want to make sure it's been tested so that that version of the intervention or that version of the prescription is still going to work. Yeah. So you're absolutely right on that. You have to make sure that you're still staying very true to it. Otherwise, it's a new intervention and then you have to test it again.
Yeah.
Right. So, that might not be something you can do as a sole practitioner. If you're a sole practitioner, you might not be doing that. But if you're in the business of trying new interventions and you're really going down that path, then you have to make sure you actually test it again. It doesn't just happen once. And so we do that continuously here. We have a learning healthcare system. We collect the data, we compare it, and we evolve over time by keep checking on the outcome measures to make sure they still stay true. And it's quite a process. But there's things that you can still do within your own practice by evaluating your outcome measures and making sure you seek, good feedback from people who've received the intervention to get that feedback about how it's working. So those are things you can do as a sole practitioner, but as a larger organisation, there's responsibilities that you can be a part of as well. Yeah.
That's a really good point. It's all scalable, isn't it?
It is.
It doesn't have to be big, overwhelming change to be change. It can be, one small step at a time.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's what I like about this area is that there's so much you can do and there's so much within our control. Because I think it can seem very easy to go, oh, but this is the evidence, but the outer setting can't change any of that. Oh my goodness. Like it can feel very debilitating to think of what you can do, but you can actually look at the levels that you can influence each time. Yeah. I know what it's like. It's hard, but there are there's great outcomes on the other side as well, and it makes you more efficient in terms of what you can do too.
Yeah, the more you flex that muscle,
that's right.
The easier it becomes over time, and there might be an appetite for bigger change down the track.
That's right.
If that's what is required.
But I think the core to all of that is you still stay really grounded on what is the theory or I loved how Brian talked about that. Like, what is your murder learning theory? What is that? And if you're staying really true to that, it means at least your approach remains, your principles still remain the same throughout that whole process, and you're not deviating too far from that. And that itself, as a clinician, I think it's really worthwhile you thinking about what your approach is. I'm not sure we ever take time to stop and think about it.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I really do think about that a lot these days. And I go, this is the approach. These are the reasons why, all the evidence that backs it. So within that framework, you have a lot of freedom within that.
Yeah.
So it's not like the frameworks keep you trapped. They actually give you a lot of freedom when you know what it is that guides your practice.
Guiding principles.
Yeah, that's right.
I love that. I think that's a great point to end on.
Oh, thank you very much. I think it's good. Yeah. So I hope this helps to maybe conjure up more conversations about how you implement. I'm almost going to say it again, implementate. How you implement, nearly finished that way. How you implement research. It is a process. And as you gain more knowledge, it's little tweaks along the way on these levels, the inner setting, the outer setting, your adaptability on innovation as an individual level.
Yeah.
And as you do that, you soon realize that as new research comes about, it's not overwhelming. It's just like little tweaks along the way.
Yeah.
And I think it's ever so doable. And then what you see is great outcomes. Guaranteed. I see those great outcomes all the time because research works.
On that note, we will include a link to the consolidated framework for implementation research.
Yes.
It's about implementation in a research setting, but I think there's a lot of principles that are very applicable to evidence-based practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I love it.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dayna.
And I'll talk to you all again next time. Bye.
Bye.